Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Let's begin with our top story tonight. Pakistan says India is planning to manage a military strike against Pakistan. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi called out India during his visit to the UAE. This was followed by a tweet thread from Dr. Moeed Yusuf, Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on National Security and Chairman Strategic Policy Planning. The same day, Indian occupation forces opened fire at a jeep carrying UN officers. The jeep had clear UN markings and the UN flag. The officers, part of the UN military observer group in India and Pakistan, had a narrow escape. UNMOGIP observes and reports, investigate complaints of ceasefire violations and submits its finding to each party and to the Secretary General. While India insists that UNMOGIP's mandate has lapsed, the mission continues, given the dispute is still on the agenda of the UN Security Council. To discuss these developments further, I'm joined by Dr. Moeed Yusuf, PM's National Security Advisor, and Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Director of Analytical Development at the Center for Global Policy. We'll begin with Moeed and then get to Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Moeed, thank you for joining me. Now, as I said in my opening, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi chose the UAE to call out India and talk of credible intelligence about a false flag operation and an Indian surgical strike. Was there a reason he chose to say it in the UAE? Was it because of the Indian Army Chief's first ever visit earlier this month to Saudi Arabia and the UAE?
No, I mean, this was just coincidental, quite frankly, because the foreign minister was in the UAE at the time. We had this information, we were processing this information, and it so happened that once we had informed the key third parties that India we knew was in touch with, this was the right timing. We didn't want to delay it when you have this kind of information. And you know better than me, Ejaz, that these kind of operations, if they're ever going to be a military misadventure, is based on the element of surprise. So we wanted to make it public and let the enemy know. Since our top diplomat was in the UAE, yes, this was brought up in the UAE, of course. And yes, we did the press conference there because we wanted to inform international media. And it so happened he was there. Of course, it is correct that if we are doing it in the UAE, then it wouldn't be possible without them allowing this press conference to be arranged. And so that should also tell you where our partners stand on this.
Right. So one of the criticisms of Pakistan's repeated warnings in the past year about a possible Indian strike is that no such strike has happened. And it's akin to crying wolf. How would you respond to that?
Yes, this has come up here in Pakistan. Of course, the Indians are going to use this, and I've seen it there. But also, I saw on social media some responses to my own tweets arguing this. Look, this is one to understand very carefully. Once you have general information about India wanting to do something, thinking of doing something, we've traditionally said, oh, there are risks of a false flag operation. There's a possibility. The Prime Minister has said it, others have said it. That's not specific to the key information on, oh, here is what is about to happen, right? But as a responsible state, we have decided, I've said this to you again and again on your program, on others, and this is my conviction, and inshallah history will tell that we were right on this. We are no longer going to be shy in terms of talking to the world about what India or anybody else is doing. 3 points to at least my doctrine on how I come at this: unapologetic, proactive, but pragmatic. That's what we are doing. So we put that information out. This particular one, or ones like these, and I know at least one occasion, some months back, almost a year back, in fact, if not more, when we had this kind of information, and at that time too, the foreign minister had gone public, and we made a decision that we will absolutely bring the third parties in the loop, and we will go public with this. Now, when you go public, what's the point? It's not cinema, it's not theater. As I've said to you before in the earlier answer, these operations, whatever one may call them, India calls them surgical strike, whatever, there's nothing surgical or strike. It's a military misadventure that will be responded to in a way that they will never be able to forget it. But in any case, when you think of something like this, it is only and only possible if you maintain the element of surprise. So if I, as a Pakistani a decision maker or advisor, or the prime minister as a supreme decision maker. When we make a decision to go public, it is essentially deterrence. Once you do that, once you tell the third parties who India is in touch with, there's almost no possibility. You'd have to be crazy. You have to be crazy even to think about doing this to Pakistan, but even crazier to go ahead and do something like this when you know that Pakistan knows exactly what you're planning. So the goal of going public is not to let this thing happen. Now, when we are successful, the thing doesn't happen. And when it doesn't happen, people say, oh, this is crying wolf, because nothing happened. So as Pakistani leadership, there are two options. You please the public, you please the world, and you don't say anything. God forbid something happens. We will, of course, respond. Do you want to get into that situation? Or is it better as responsible officials that we decide we're going to make it public? India is not going to dare to do it. And the losses will be prevented if there were going to be any. That's the responsible thing to do. Yes, people will say you're crying wolf. That's fine. That's a minor issue for us. For us, the major issue is the enemy must know we know everything they're up to. And if they try, the response, I've told you, Ijaz, they will never forget.
Right, so there is a dilemma here. Anyway, another criticism is that the government is under pressure. That is, the Pakistani government is under pressure because of the political opposition, and also that Pakistan's diplomacy hasn't borne much fruit with reference to India's illegal occupation of Indian-occupied Kashmir. Now, invoking a putative Indian strike, according to this criticism, is therefore a diversion by Pakistan.
Quite frankly, if India is going to raise this issue, I understand it. Because that's the point we are making to the world. India is looking for a diversion. It's Indian farmers who are marching on New Delhi. It is India that's illegally occupying Kashmir, making it an open jail and violating every single international law and norm there is. It is India that has been talking about its own Muslims as subhumans, as termites, as the Corona jihad point, and you name it. They've gone bonkers. I'm sorry, but they have. So they are trying to divert attention, Ijaz. They are trying to get the world off what their own follies and failings are by continuing to talk about, we're going to do this to Pakistan and that. Okay, that's one. Second, let me ask you a question. India's mantra has been, something's happened in India, it's Pakistan. What has happened in India? What has Pakistan done? What is the reason to talk about this kind of military misadventure? They are desperate. They're struggling. So let's not allow them this conversation. Let's not allow them to flip the conversation and talk about Pakistan's diversion. Now, having said that, on Pakistan's front, what do we have to divert from? If you're talking of politics, let me just make this very clear. I've said this to you before, I've said this to others before. My office is supra-political. That's my oath. We deal with national security issues writ large. We cannot allow politicization of these topics. And let me tell you very clearly, my office, the Foreign Office, others, every office that's relevant, were involved in making this choice, this decision, and going public with this and distilling this information. So there's no question of any diversion, because I'm telling you myself that we absolutely as a system decided to go public with this, talk to other countries as we should have. Not for any political reason, but because we had information, we wanted to make sure there's not even a 1% chance of any misadventure. That's why we did it. No politics here. As far as the world is not responding, look, I've told you we are going to be unapologetic. No more shyness around this. We are going to put our view out there. And we know that the world is not going to respond positively instantly. They look at India as a counterweight to China, the Western world. India does buy more arms than Pakistan and most of the world, in fact. Yes, there are interests there, we know that. So what? We should keep quiet, we should let that happen, we should just give India a pass? Maybe that was the policy of the past. I see no hope, unfortunately, of the trajectory that India is on changing for the better, and thus we must put it out. We must let the world know what India is doing. If not today, then tomorrow or day after, the world will recognize that India is a global liability. But today, I do ask the question of the United Nations. Does such a rogue actor, such a mafia, deserve to be a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. They make the UN system look bad. That's as simple as that.
Right. So I'm assuming that the question you asked me was a rhetorical question, because in this format, as you know, you can't ask me a question. It's my job to ask questions and not debate the issue. And, you know, talking about debate, since you are a scholar of political science and international relations, you know that if there were a debate, we could have debated the issue on the basis of literature, on the diversionary hypothesis and the rest of it. So anyway, also, I have to ask questions on the basis of perceptions that come my way. But I take your point. And I understand, as I said, there's a dilemma here also. The situation is very complex. So anyway, let's move on to strategic communication. Now, immediately after the foreign minister's presser, as I said in my opening also, you took to Twitter and you wrote a thread with reference to what the FM had said. Now, is that part of the coordination you've been talking about in terms of strategic communication?
That's exactly it. Look, I mean, coordination is perhaps not the strongest suit that we've had in the past, and thus, wherever there are weaknesses, we must improve. If we don't introspect, don't learn lessons, then we also won't overcome our weaknesses. So yes, we are trying very hard. Strategic communications cannot happen without good coordination. So, civil, within civilian government, departments, civil military, we're all on 100% the same wavelength. We've got mechanisms now, and yes, that is one example of it.
Right. One final question and a quick response, Moeed. I talked about the Indian troops opening fire on the UN vehicle. What has been the UN reaction to that incident? I haven't really come across any condemnation.
Well, they've confirmed the incident formally. Pakistan's reached out. Our permanent rep to the UN, Ambassador Munir Akram, has written directly to the UN. We've, of course, made all this public as well, and whatever inquiry needs to be done by the UN, we welcome that. But there has to be more than that, you're right. And so far, I'm not aware of anything. So if the UN is not going to respond, come down with a very heavy hand, when directly their own vehicles and officials are being targeted, then what's the message to India? You're emboldening them to continue being a rogue actor. So I hope there is more, and we are going to pursue this with the UN as much as possible.
Right. Thank you, Moeed. That was Dr. Moeed Yusuf speaking with us. Let me get to Dr. Kamran Bokhari, who's been patiently listening in on this. Kamran, you heard Moeed. So let's begin with your first impressions of what he has said in terms of, as I said, the dilemma also, and of course, the logic of doing what Pakistan is doing.
Ijaz, I think that it's clear that Islam felt that it was important to put this out. I don't know how they process the information. In other words, what is the determination of reliability? What are the details? How soon will this happen? But I think that it was critical enough. It was deemed critical enough by the security stakeholders to say, okay, we're not going to sit on this. We're not going to ignore it. We're not going to sort of say, hey, these kind of informations come every once in a while, and so we're going to take this serious. So that much is clear. But I'm more interested in how, what was the determination? What level of threat did the Pakistani stakeholders see between, the intelligence services, the Prime Minister's office, the Foreign Office, Moeed's office? What was that? How reliable, how critical of a threat was this? Or is this something that was for diplomatic use and that the threat was not deemed too high? I think I'm leaning towards the latter.
Right. Clearly, you and I cannot really, speak of this with any great degree of certainty because neither of us is privy to this information. What kind of information, as you mentioned, at what level, how were the pieces put together, what was the determination? But it does seem to me, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, that it was considered significant enough for Pakistan to have decided, okay, we're not going to wait for the foreign minister to come back to Islamabad and talk about it. And so he actually called a presser in the UAE. Is that something you would agree with?
Yes, but I would caveat that. I would say that, so I'm just going to put myself in their shoes and sort of speak from, that perspective. So if this was, there are many options on how to break this information, depending on how critical, how significant of a threat that Pakistan is facing in the light of this intelligence. If it was very, very critical, if it was deemed, imminent, urgent, you could have had DGISPR come and speak about this. You could have had Moeed do the press conference. You could have had the Prime Minister also weigh in on this, issue a statement. There were multiple ways. If this was an actual military imminent threat, I think that, again, I'm speculating. You're right. I don't have access to the information. But the way
neither do I. I mean, of us are not privy to it.
Yeah, and so the fact that it was channeled through the foreign minister who was on an overseas trip to the Gulf, that to me seems like it wasn't really imminent, but there was something credible there that Pakistan needed to put out, as Moeed said, to the world stage that, look, this is what we're facing in this region. That's sort of my bottom line.
I think I would tend to agree with you, because you can actually square what Moeed said with what you were saying, that while it was a coincidence that the foreign minister was in the UAE, this thing comes and then you decide that, okay, so this is a force multiplier of sorts, diplomatically speaking. I'm also joined by Ambassador Tasnim Aslam, the former Special Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Ambassador Aslam. Stay with me. I just want to ask Kamran a question which is more about the MilOp kind of thing, before I come to you for a broader sort of insight into this. Kamran, so you and I know, since it's an occupational hazard, that we have to look at the analyses put out by Indian defense experts. So there is a sense that using ground troops for even for shallow incursions, obviously runs the risk of people getting killed, people getting captured. Then they are also not particularly keen, since the 27th Feb 2019 episode, to use the Air Force. So there has been a sense that they could probably, for instance, they've been talking about this Pinaka Mark II, which has a 75-kilometer range, a CEP of 10 meters, something that they could use. But then that runs the risk of Pakistan retaliation. I mean, in any case, if whatever they do, that runs the risk of Pakistan's retaliation. And given various other factors, as a student of military affairs, do you think that they would try to plan something like this at this particular point in time? They are already in the process of spending a lot of money building the military habitat along the line of actual control.
So, Ijaz, you're absolutely right. Look, there are a number of reasons why I don't think that the Indians will do that. But to answer your question, the element of surprise is not just in timing, but in the method of striking. So if you have struck, those shallow incursions in 2016, and then, the use of fixed-wing aircraft in Balakot in 2019, then you can't repeat that, because the other side is already prepping for it. You want to be able to do it in a way that you think, or reasonably think, that the other side isn't expecting. Now, if you are talking about this on Pakistani television, surely the principals of the Pakistani military are well aware of what the Indians are planning, and they have planned accordingly. The Indians know that. The other thing I want to point out here is that, look, you do military operations based on a perceived advantage. And I don't think I see the advantage for India right now. There's just so much going on domestically. You've got COVID, you've got farmers' protests, you have the general state of the economy, and you have a situation with China on the LAC. You also have, the international community is not in a mood for this kind of thing. India will look like it's the aggressor. Does India want to come out and look like the aggressor? They want to be able to milk this for whatever it's worth. But I don't think that factoring in all those things that they see any gain. I mean, I just don't see what they will gain. The cost has to be low. The gain has to be significantly high to make it worthwhile, the effort. So I don't know. I mean, they're saying, okay, diversion from domestic politics, but what if it backfires? What if this spirals out of control?
I agree. I agree with you, Kamran. And as a matter of fact, as I said to Moeed also, there is, and you know this, there is a lot of literature on this diversionary hypothesis, and there are people scholars who agree with this, and there are other scholars that are not particularly convinced that there is enough empirical evidence to say that this thing actually happens. But we don't have time to get into the academic side of this theory. But let me pull in Ambassador Aslam here. Ambassador Aslam, thank you as always for being on the program. You're talking about the foreign minister's press up, the whole thing about the false flag and stage managing a conflict with Pakistan, and also the firing at the Moeed vehicle, for which, surprisingly enough, the United Nations hasn't really condemned that. So give me your sense of this whole thing in terms of how you would analyze this.
Thank you. Ijaz, first, I'm not surprised that the UN has not reacted or condemned the incident. We have a long history. We have seen how India, step by step, completely neutralized and then rejected the Moeed mission. They stopped cooperation. They moved them from their long held residence or place of abode. Then India stopped responding to any correspondence or questions from Moeed. And over the years, we have seen that the UN system not only accepted that, but India was rewarded for its non-cooperation. I'll give you an example. Every time there is a ceasefire violation or some exchange on the line of control, we take the Moeed to the spot. We provide them all the evidence. We answer their questions. And how do they balance their reports to their headquarters? By citing what the Indian media says. Obviously, when governments speak, they are more circumspect, they are more responsible. Indian media is haywire in any case. And in their reports, when Pakistani official narrative is balanced by what the wild allegations that Indian media makes, so Moeed and UN system have been rewarding India for a long time. So it doesn't surprise me. I just want to see what is their threshold, how long, and what else they will
Let me interject here, Master Aslam, let me interject here. I mean, this is without prejudice to what you're saying, obviously, because what you're stating are facts. But it's very different when a UN vehicle with UN markings, with UN flag, is targeted, because you cannot really say long-range targeting. You have scopes. You can clearly see whose vehicle is that. And I think that puts a completely different construct on this particular incident. So perhaps the UN should have taken cognizance of this act of aggression.
Absolutely, it should have, and probably they would consult P5 before they respond, but I don't think there's going to be a strong response to what India is doing, and this is precisely the reason India is today in a place, very unenviable place, because the international community for a long, long time has provided India the space to do things that you don't accept from civilized societies. And look where India is. I think you were also talking about what rationale India would have for a false flag. Number one, why Foreign Minister did and should have taken the lead in talking about it through a presser is that if DGISPR had spoken about it, again, there would have been criticism that why the civilian government is not speaking. So the foreign minister, wherever he was, he didn't plan his visit. Probably at that time, he didn't know what was happening and if there was this serious and credible threat. Secondly, India has every reason to do something to divert attention from its domestic situation. The farmers' issue, the nationality issue, the Indian occupied Kashmir issue, COVID out of control, economy collapsing. What a better diversion can Modi find than start something which in their view would be a limited skirmish on the line of control with Pakistan. Secondly, we have seen that India did not gain anything by the Balakot misadventure. But nonetheless, and they would have known Pakistan would respond because it was made very clear to them prior to it. Yet they did it. So
no, I understand. I understand, Ambassador Aslam. I understand, and reasons you have cited and counted, shall I say, listed in relation to why India would like to divert are, paradoxically the very reasons which one can invoke to argue differently. But thank you so much. That was Ambassador Tasnim Aslam speaking with us. Let me, before I wrap up, quickly go back to Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Kamran, one of the issues obviously is that the world works in and through the realist framework, and while we talk about the moral normative aspects, and sometimes they actually pop up, but that also happens when there is a realist requirement for the states to actually rely on them. So I think one of the issues that we are facing, shall I say Pakistan is facing, is that we have a strong legal, moral, normative sort of case. But the world obviously is working, as I said, in and through the realist framework. I think that is where the challenge really lies. I just want to get a quick comment from you on that.
No, absolutely. Look, there is the case of, from a normative point of view as to what's happening on the Indian side of here, as what's happening inside India. And it's not like the world isn't talking about it. It is, Western press has consistently been picking up on these things, especially in the light of, or the frame of the agenda of the Modi government, the Hindu nationalist government. So that's happening. But look, there are other things that are far more important from a realist, pragmatic point of view. COVID overshadows everything. U.S.-China relations are defining U.S. behavior in the world. We just saw a naval destroyer pass through the Straits of Taiwan, which was shadowed by the U.S. military the Chinese military on Saturday. On Sunday, the Chinese sent a carrier group through that same place, through the Straits down to the South China Sea. This is what the framework is. Unfortunately, Pakistan and India, whatever their conflict is, regardless of the details, is perceived in Washington from that framework. Pakistan is an ally of China, so that's something that the Americans are going to look at it, and the rest of the world. India is seen as an ally of the United States in its efforts to counter China, and that's where we are. And I think this is the framework that stakeholders in Pakistan need to zero in on, focus more on, and find ways to deal with it. There is, an opportunity to balance between China and the United States. We just had a webinar at the Center for Global Policy on this. One of the speakers was a former Afghanistan-Pakistan director in the Obama administration. It was a very rich conversation on how to balance, how Pakistan could balance, what can the United States do. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that this isn't a zero sum. There's plenty of room for maneuver for Pakistan to achieve its strategic goals, but the key is to think outside the box and sort of move away from sort of that India-centric only factor, look at it in the big picture and say, well, how important is it for the United States? And even how important is it for the Chinese?
Right. This obviously requires another program, and I'll certainly look up the webinar that you're talking about. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Kamran Bokhari speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the Indian disinformation operation, which was unearthed by EU Disinfo Lab. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. For our second segment, we revisit India's disinformation operation, which was unearthed by EU Disinfo Lab, which is an independent non-profit organization that monitors, tracks down, and exposes disinformation and influence operations. The Disinfo Lab investigators mention in their extensive and intensive report that they were astounded by the scale, scope, and sophistication of the operation and the layers of fakery. We covered this in our program last Monday, but we're revisiting it because this is a big story and has unfortunately still been underreported. I have with me Hamza Hussain, who's a computing columnist for CGTN and visiting fellow at the Stimson Center at Washington, D.C. I also sent 2 questions to Andy Warmoth, who's a member of International Alliance for the Defense of Right and Freedom. Andy has agitated this issue in Europe. My 2 questions to Andy were, the Disinfo Lab report does not directly accuse the Indian government as being behind this operation, but do you think, as in does Andy think, given the sophistication and spread of it, that it could have happened without support from a state or its intelligence agencies? And my second question to him was, given that the operators stole and used other people's and organizations' identities, created fake organizations and NGOs, even got them registered, are we talking criminality here? As in, can Pakistan press any legal charges? So we'll play the recorded responses of Andy Warmoth and then get to Hamza Hussain.
Out of the article by Le Jour, in which they claimed that the entire operation could be linked to Indian intelligence services. We can certainly say that this campaign was organized with the knowledge of the highest regions of Indian leadership, with the aim of isolating both China and Pakistan at the United Nations and in the European Union. In addition, the credibility of the European Union and the United Nations as a whole has affected us also. India must now immediately be put on the international scene for this campaign. We need urgently a committee of inquiry, and we have to set this up in the Indian Parliament also, but also within the United Nations, the European Union, and by the Pakistani and Chinese authorities. Such an operation must please never happen again. Therefore, we have to do this. A large part of the Disinfo Lab 2020 study examines how Asian News International uses this fake news information from the European Chronicle and other Srivastava-linked organization in order to convince Indian audiences that Modi's activities are supported by the European Union. The study reports that Yahoo News India and BP Business World have reproduced this year at least 8 articles from Asian News International based on fake news spread by the EU Chronicle. Even the Business Standard newspaper and the Times of India have used this type of material to convince their people and to give
Absolutely.
it as
I mean, this
news.
is exactly. I mean, this is Andy Warmoth is right. This is the kind of cascading effect that the report talks about. Let's get to Hamza Rifat here. Hamza, you did a program on this. In fact, you had Andy Warmoth on your program, but for that, you also worked on this EU Disinfo Lab report. Give me your sense of, there are two things here, and these are two issues that I pointed to on my program last Monday also. One, that our 5th gen warriors keep talking about 5th gen war, but we were waiting for EU Disinfo Lab to actually work this for us. So is this an issue of capacity? And secondly, as I said in my opening, and I said this earlier also on my program, that this has been underreported, massively underreported, I would say, in our domestic media, especially TV channels. Why do you think that is the case?
All right, Ijaz, there are 2 to 3 things here. First of all, Andy Warmoth's outrage is pretty much, you could say, justified because of the fact that we're not talking about simple cybercrime or cybercrime attack. We're talking about a systematic campaign which has been going on for 15 years. And it basically involves roughly about 750 fake media outlets and close to 550 domain names. So, I mean, to come to your first question, I think it's not really a case of Pakistan's capacity that is in question. I think it's more to do with the systematic campaign which has been launched by the BJP leadership. Now, we need to understand that this has been going on for 15 years. We also had the Congress party's government in India prior to the Modi-led BJP regime. So this is not a case of the right-wingers or the far-right leaders trying to isolate Pakistan or China or any of India's perceived adversaries. I think it's more to do with the fact that it has pretty much a lot of resonance inside the Indian political leadership, that this is how we need to launch fake campaigns through fake identities and fabrication. So I don't think it's a capacity issue as far as Pakistan is concerned, but it's more to do with the fact that this is part of a campaign from a secular democracy or a country which touts itself to be a secular democracy to try and make sure that their narrative is promoted in international institutions at the expense of its opposition, which could be China, Pakistan, or any country which disagrees with India's narrative.
So I'm happy that you brought the fact that it's not just the Modi government, because 15 years of spread means this began in 2005, 2006. And Modi was not on the scene at that time. But allow me to say that, there is an issue of capacity, because the adversary will do what the adversary does. So we have to be prepared for that. And in this particular, era of digital communication, influence operations, fakery, layers of fakery, it's very common. But another interesting point about this operation was that generally, and I discussed this with experts last Monday on my program, that you come in, you target a particular event, and you get out. And Exhibit A, the Russian influence operation, 2016 US elections, and there are other examples also. But this stayed there. This was the scale and scope, as I said, was really big. And in 2019, Disinfo Lab unearthed this. But this time when they went in for a dive again, they realized that they shut down some of those entities that had been exposed and came up with others. So in this digital world, it's extremely, I mean, Andy was saying that, we need to make sure this never happens again, but this will, because that's in the nature of the digital world.
That's very true, Ijaz. And you mentioned how certain NGOs which had actually become defunct were actually propped up once again. And so it clearly shows that if there's any redundancy as far as NGOs are concerned, experts are concerned, EU diplomats are concerned, India's campaign has been so systematic and so vitriolic that it basically looks forward to the prospect of propping up those very same individuals time and time again, as well as those NGOs. Now, let me give you an example. Now, on the sidelines of the EU, you have the South Asia Peace Forum, for example, or the South Asia Minorities Forum. It was found out within the Indian Chronicles that none of these forums actually existed. These were only propped up by roughly about 40 to 50% of the, these defunct NGOs were actually propped up, or these forums were propped up by the Srivastava family. Yeah. So it will be propped up again unless and until India is being held to account. Now, the problem really is that this secular democracy model that India has been exporting to the West, with many of these EU countries, have sidelined such activities, and they've actually been more concerned about targeted campaigns from China and from Pakistan and from other countries, which might actually be averse to EU values to a large extent. So it is it's not only egregious human rights violations, but it's at the very same time, it is a violation of privacy. It is lack of transparency as well. And in this digital world, you need to nab and hold a country to account, given the fact that it's not only Pakistan and China, but also the identities of senior EU diplomats which are also at stake. So it's about fabrication, lies, falsification of information, which has resulted in this happening.
Right. Unfortunately, this is a pretty nebulous domain in the sense, in terms of the legal normative standards, not so much normative, but legal standards. And I spoke with a couple of legal experts on this last week, and they said that it'll be very difficult to figure out how to actually find criminality in this. So that's one area of concern. But I do think that there is now some traction, because you might recall that a couple of days ago, a German court sentenced an Indian for working for Indian intelligence and those operations being directed right out of the Indian consulate in Frankfurt. And this is incidentally the fourth Indian to have been sentenced by a German court in the last 3 years. But one final question, Hamza, going back to the underreporting of this in our local media, especially TV channels. Why do you think that is the case?
Look, Ijaz, I was actually quite surprised that this was so underreported, because we have been constantly peddling the narrative that India has been committing egregious violations of human rights in Kashmir. We already had the dossier that was actually presented to the United Nations regarding Indian subversive activities. So it came as a bit of a surprise to me that this was not propped up in the manner that in which, maybe the PDM protests, for example, or maybe Prime Minister Imran Khan's legitimacy. Certain channels have also been questioning that. So it does come as a bit of a surprise, because if you look at it from a larger perspective, Pakistan's adversary, which is India, would prop up any sort of, you could say, false information and debate it on different forums. You have the likes of various journalists on Times Now, would not like to take names, but the fact remains that they would come up with falsified information and try to speak and debate about them. So this was the time, because you see, it's not about Islamabad coming up with a conspiracy theory. Neither is it China promoting its agenda. This is a leak from an NGO which has nothing to do with the EU Parliament. So the impartiality of the findings cannot be debated. So this was the time when Pakistan was supposed to go on to the front foot and come up with a media offensive and debate and discuss as to, because this vindicates Pakistan's stance. We have constantly maintained that India has been on a disinformation campaign. And so this kind of vindicates our stance. So it came as a bit of a surprise. I frankly think that the Pakistani media, I'm not referring to you, Ijaz, but I'm talking about generally the media channels are more concerned about PDM protests and domestic discord as compared to an issue of international significance as this, because this directly deals with Pakistan's narrative in international forums such as the United Nations, and to cut down that narrative and promote the adversary's own through unfair play is completely unacceptable.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It's unfortunate. It's, and I said this last Monday also, that if the shoe were on the other foot, if this was an operation that was presumably launched by Pakistan, the Indian media and the government would have gone around the globe crying blue murder. But thank you so much. That was Hamza Rifat speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.